You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
Hi everyone, welcome to Where No Bubs Has Gone Before, a Star Trek The Next Generation podcast starring myself, Jay Reckward, and my father, Jake Reckward. We're producing this podcast for the benefit of my son and Jake's grandson, Benjamin Jacob Reckward, but we know there's so many great Star Trek The Next Generation fans out there that we're putting these shows out on YouTube for free. How are you doing tonight, Jake?
I'm good, Jay, and you?
I'm doing great. I think we're in for a fun episode. We're reviewing Star Trek The Next Generation Season 2, Episode 4, The Outrageous Okana, which debuted on December 12th, 1988.
Right.
It's, I think this is the first episode of the season that is actually kind of a fluff episode, but it's a lot of fun, and it kind of continues the growing quality of the series, especially this season. I think that this is a really well put together episode, and it does a lot of things while not doing anything serious at all. What did you think of the episode before we dig into it?
I think again, like we've talked, some of the stories in the second season, they're a lot tighter. There's like one, main theme, and then there's a secondary story. It's not three and four, where I think when you have that many different stories going on, it can kind of get confusing unless you really know how to segue between things. I'm just thinking that like Blue Bloods, if you ever watch that cop show on CBS, they generally have at least three storylines going on at once, and they're very good about how they segue, how they transition from one story to the other. So I think there's a real skill in writing to that.
Well, one thing that you noted in your notes, and I've also seen in the show that's deployed very well, is that they'll start with a main storyline, and then something will happen along the way with a character, and that character will fork off on their own.
Right.
And we'll develop that character throughout the episode, kind of below the main thing that's happening. I think that's actually done very well here with Data, who is the fork, in terms of learning kind of the concept of human humor. But let's dig into the episode real quick before we really explore some of these themes and new characters. So the Enterprise D is on the way to, and I had to look at this a couple times. They pronounce it two different ways on the show: the Omega Sagitta system or the Sagitta system. But they're traveling in the Omega Sagitta system between two twin planets inhabited by two humanoid races who have a pact called the Medina Coalition. And the Enterprise actually stumbles on a Class 9 starship with a human pilot inside that turns out to be Captain Thadian Okana, who has had problems with his guidance system. The Enterprise offers Captain Okana help repairing his faulty guidance system, and during his introduction, Deanna Troi establishes his roguelike characteristics, making him a suspicious character who should not be taken lightly as he's brought aboard the Enterprise. That's kind of a fair summary of, the entire episode. We're going to be dealing with this roguish character, and there's going to be a lot of humor and kind of dashing romance going on, but what did you think of Okana and... Well, actually, before we get to Okana, One note that I had actually made was, we see the Enterprise on their way a lot for diplomatic missions. We see them for scientific surveys. We see them often delivering things for um, a whole sundry of tasks, from dealing with epidemics to uh, patrolling the neutral zone for Romulans. This is an episode where they literally happen upon someone and rescue them in the midst of a engineering failure. And I think that says something interesting about Starfleet and the fact that they have, at least in the Alpha Quadrant, some sort of international space law that kind of binds them to be good Samaritans, in the case of someone waylaid in space on a ship that has lost propulsion. Um, what do you think of that and the ramifications that it has in the future of space? Like, do you think that this is a good thing that the Federation has this kind of presence in space, or it, do you have any thoughts on it?
Yeah, you've brought this up before. It's like, well, what is the main mission of the Federation and of the starships? And particularly a large starship like the Enterprise seems to be very versatile because of the number of people it has on board and the specialties they have, and the experience of the senior officers and so on. So Picard can be a warrior, he can be a diplomat, he can be a
Mm-hmm.
philosopher. They got people like Troy on board who has that empathic capability. um, Guinan even comes into that at times. They act as a medical
And we're
mercy
going to talk
ship.
about her a lot.
Yeah, they act as a medical mercy ship. They act as uh, uh, a spaceborne uh, hospital. They can be a warship. In this case, they're almost like the Coast Guard. Um,
Yeah.
they're just they're out there in the galaxy, and they monitor, checking, like, what other vessels might be nearby them. If they get a distress signal, they're always investigating that. So it would really be interesting to see, what the detailed orders that Picard was actually given as to these are the things you do in order of priority.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good point. Especially because it's not, well, there is a star date to this episode. The
Yeah,
star date, we were traveling in like,
42402.7.
um you made a note of that. Have they been have we been following we haven't been following the star dates.
I've started to put them on my notes, and at some point we need to, next, maybe the next episode, we need to research that and understand what the basis for the star date is, because sometimes, at the beginning of an episode they'll say the star date's blah blah blah, and at the end there'll
Right.
be captain's supplemental note or first officer's supplemental log, and they'll give the star date, and it's advanced some, and I don't understand how that clock works.
I think we do need to look into that, especially if we have episodes where, I know many times, if the Enterprise has to book it, they go to warp 9. But
Mm-hmm.
even at warp 9, there's been times where they've said it's going to take 3 days or it's going to take 4 days at maximum warp to reach this destination. I think you're right. We need to start following these star dates just to get a track of how long the narrative actually takes place,
Mm-hmm.
um, in real time in terms of that universe. So
Right.
that's a really good point.
And
Um,
it's interesting because if you go back to the Enterprise series, they already did it by Earth calendar. They didn't have star dates back then.
right. Oh
Archer.
yeah, you're absolutely right. And there were periods of weeks that would often
Mm-hmm.
leap between episodes sometimes.
Right.
Um,
Yes.
Especially since the maximum was warp 5. So,
It took them a lot longer to get from point A to point B at times.
well, there is a conversation in Star Trek lore about how those how the different levels of warp are actually scaled, in terms of their multiples. So the idea is that if you're at warp 1, you're going 1,000 times the speed of light. I'm pretty sure I'm getting this right. If you're at warp 2, warp 3, you're getting exponentially faster and faster. But I think
Yes.
the problem is, they always have the warp 10 barrier, which I think is somehow the transdimensional warp barrier that they later play with in Voyager. The Borg have actually mastered this technology, and since we'll be meeting the Borg this season, we're going to have a conversation about transwarp technology, because even though it's not mentioned in this season, we have to figure out a way for the Borg to get from where they are in the Delta Quadrant to um, getting to the neutral zone in the Federation territory. But there's been a conversation of how fast were the ships really compared to each other.
Well, if you go on YouTube, I've seen a couple
Right.
uh, videos where they'll have the different starships and the warp speed, and they'll go from Earth out to like Pluto or something like that. And it really shows the exponential difference from warp 2 to warp 6 to warp 7, etc.
Right. But there's an episode where I think Jordy even talks about he was talking to Scotty. It was the one with the Dyson sphere, about how they rescaled the warp speeds to where warp 5 I think was downgraded to like warp 3 or something like
Huh.
that.
I didn't
So,
realize that.
but by that comparison, Archer is moving very, very slowly in terms of exploration compared to Picard. And getting back to, one of the aspects you brought up about the kind of service the Enterprise is expected to render in space, um, it seems very odd that this this state of the art vessel, in terms of priority of orders, and it's good that you brought that up, but it seems to me odd that like they have these moments where they just seem to be exploring, and I understand that they're sent specific places to explore. But is this episode of them just in transit from one place to another and they happen upon Okana? Because it doesn't seem like they're here in the Omega Sagitta system, um, for any great reason. Even the planets that they examine have no real value to them as they're passing by. So it gets to the question, um, you know, who who colonized these planets? Uh, they both seem to have a common origin, but they seem to have also diverged in terms of their contact.
Yeah, there's no backstory at all there. Yeah.
Well, we had
It,
that
it's it,
previous.
it's a little bit like what we've talked about, that if they were colonized by a common origin, it's kind of like we've talked about, where if humans from Earth go to Mars and we successfully colonize Mars, that
Right.
ultimately the Martians, those humans on Mars, will become Martians. And just like in
Hmm.
the expanse, there's potential that there's going to be conflict between the Earthlings and the Martians at some point in the future. And maybe that's a sort of this thing that has happened here for some reason.
I think that in science fiction, when those kind of dichotomies are set up, um, and you see that actually a lot in a Japanese anime, especially the kind of like the space mechanoid cartoons, where it's usually people piloting robotic suits in space and fighting each other with laser swords and cannons, and they still have like these huge naval battles. But there's often this theme that Mars and Earth are ultimately bound to be in conflict with each other. I often stop and think, after a previous episode we reviewed, the one where they it was the previous season, because Beverly Crusher was still there. Um, I'm gonna get this wrong. the actor who played Kirk's son is in it. It's the planet of the drug abusers and then the
Oh
drug planet.
yes, right.
Um, that episode made me think that the idea of two planets in the same system automatically coming into conflict. Pardon me. Is entirely possible. But I also think that that is probably a chance of if you happen upon it in history, where Picard, as he's cruising by, is happening on these planets as they're kind of in cultural conflict. But they could also have the sort of culture that has formed a symbiosis or maybe a parasitic culture, like we saw previously in the episode that I mentioned. Um, I think it's very interesting that science fiction writers, however, often predicate these kind of these dual planet systems on the idea that there's always going to be this natural conflict. What do you think that comes from? Do you think that that is a uniquely Western thing, or in some ways it gets back to like Romulus and Remus? There's always this,
It, it,
or Cain and Abel almost.
it's yes. Since I'm now into season 4 of Lucifer, and Kane's gone
We're
now.
totally
So
going to do a show.
yeah, that yeah, I think there's probably some sort of, I don't know what the right word for it is, but some classical theme, like from Cain and Abel, Romulus and Remus, that you have people that are close to one another, and there's a 50-50 chance, if not more, that for some competitive reasons they'll become competitors and hostile to each other. Um,
I think it's always interesting because when we talk about, well, the story of Romulus and Remus is more of a naturalistic evolutionary one where it's like one wolf kills another. Um, I think the one about Cain and Abel has always been interesting because it really is kind of like the incitement of God telling them to compete against each other. Um, you know, inserting that seed of competition between them is, I think, kind of an outside thing.
I I have to tell you a story that my maternal grandmother took to the movies when I was probably 5, maybe 5 years old, and it was a story of Romulus and Remus. And
Huh.
and my brother was only a baby then, and I remember when Romulus killed Remus in the movie, I cried. I
Yeah.
walked out of that movie crying. Like, why did he do that? Why does this have to happen?
Right. Well, I think, and this is kind of a dovetail, but we are talking about the conflict of two separate but equal in origin things. I've always thought that the idea of siblings automatically being at war is something that we've constructed in modern history. And I don't think it's actually natural to our human psychology, because I think your reaction is more in line with most normal people. Like, why would they do that? I think when most of us see someone harm another, especially if they're related or close to each other, I don't think that we often see that and kind of accept it as this natural thing. I think it's human for us to look at it and be like, why would someone do that? Um, and getting back to the episode itself, it's very. I don't think that it's necessarily clever anymore to write the scenario of two planets being at war with each other if they share the same system, like whether it's Earth versus Mars, like in The Expanse, which, even though I think that's done very well, um, I think it's just kind of overdone. And I think if you really look at kind of the scientific aspects of the future, one thing that we'll be able to do possibly in the future, The Expanse touches on this a little bit, and it takes a very cynical, quote unquote, grimdark look to it. But when we start mining the asteroid belt, we're going to be able to access mineral, liquid, just resources that will be so infinite that the idea of war automatically between Mars or automatically between Earth or automatically between anyone, is going to have to come from a different um, stimulus other than resource hoarding or scarcity. It will probably have to be something religious or something deeply political, but I don't think it's going to be over resources. I think if we get to the point that we can effectively mine the asteroid belt, a lot of our material requirements will actually be met. Because we know out on these asteroids, there are things like there are asteroids that contain oxygen in them, there's asteroids that contain water, um, there's all sorts of things, and there irons, copper, all sorts of materials are abundant in this belt. So, the automatic idea that we're going to be in conflict of it over it instead of maybe working in unification to harvest these resources. I think that's kind of a false dichotomy. I think if you take a positive or maybe even realistic bent, and I think the way society is moving now in terms of us being more conscious about our own environment and our own ecology here on Earth, uh, you know, as much as we're talking about space exploration now, uh, as it pertains to the expansion of business, but also the expansion of science, the expansion of our culture, we're starting to recognize things. I think if we didn't have the environmentalism of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, we wouldn't be talking about space junk today and how that's a real problem.
I was going to
Um,
mention that, right?
I think that we are already starting to be mindful about how our waste can impact our lives in space. And I think by the time we get to something like mining the asteroid belt, we will actually have fixed these problems. And if we can fix these problems, I think that we will have fixed a lot of the problems that we face here on Earth or on Luna when we finally colonize Luna, and then Mars. I think part of the problem with these narratives and the way these stories are written um, falls into the idea that at some point all these relationships of reliance and reciprocity just fail.
Hmm.
And the thing that causes wars and the thing that causes conflict truly is the loss of reciprocity in a relationship. There has to be this nature of give and take, but it also has to be, a beneficial give and take. I
Hmm.
give you this so you can survive and thrive, and you give me this so I can survive and thrive.
Sure, right.
We are not getting to Mars from Earth unless we colonize the moon and turn it into a forward operating base so we can launch from the moon. It's easier to plan actual launches to Mars from a lunar orbit, believe it or not, because the moon moves a little bit faster. Um, at the same time, you're going to need that connection back and forth between Earth and Mars in the interim to keep resources going back and forth. And then, if we go all the way out past the asteroid belt to Jupiter or to the ice planets beyond Uranus, there are so many things that are going to require teamwork and coordination that any sort of conflict will stop dead in its tracks. And, you know, one thing, and, I've been watching a lot of The Expanse. I'm into season 4 now. Um, One thing that kind of concerns me about the show from a critical perspective is that it's built on the idea that once humans are given the room and ability to expand and colonize and find new mineral resources and discover that there is enough room for everyone in space, that somehow our conflicts are going to get 1,000 times worse. And I think one of the problems that we're facing here in the modern world is that it feels like, and part of this is the internet, but it feels like we're constantly just being bunched together, whether it's on Facebook or
Well,
Twitter.
I mean, the good example of that, you're talking about space and geography. Um,
Right.
it gets into the whole issue with Hitler and the Nazis that they wanted, because of their master race theory, they wanted Lebensraum. And that's why they wanted, to take the Ukraine and go all the way to the Urals. And um, I think the best current example of that is the whole controversy about who really owns the South China Sea. I think that
Right.
nine dash mapping that the Chinese have done, where they say, "Oh, it's the South China Sea, so it's all ours," is just ridiculous. When you have the Philippines and Vietnam and uh, Brunei and all these other nations that have that are right on the South China Sea, and the reason they do that is there's competition for resources, and they're
Hmm.
all bunched together.
Well, it's the problem with China and the South China Sea is that China is expecting a certain level of privilege that exceeds the privilege of most other modern nations.
And
You
and
know,
the other example with this is now
they're
there's
basically asking to do away with international waters
right.
in their region.
Well, and the thing is also now it's that there's going to be competition for the control of the Arctic Ocean, particularly
Right.
as the ice cap melts. And, the Russians should have a lot of influence there because they have the largest coastline on the Arctic Ocean.
Right.
And then you got Denmark with Greenland and Canada and the US and Norway a little bit. And then China says, well, we're going to play there. Well, why the hell should the Chinese be involved in the Arctic Ocean? They have no common coastline in the Arctic Ocean. It's
Well,
ridiculous.
I think part of the thing that um, kind of getting to my criticism of the Expanse again, all of this is built on the idea that scarcity is a real thing that has to be maintained.
That's a theme that we've talked about at points during the first season. Yes.
Well, you know, the beautiful thing about Star Trek, and people might call it the naive thing about Star Trek, but the beautiful thing about Star Trek is that it really is built on the idea that people finally moved beyond the scarcity culture, and
Exactly.
that we're able
Right.
to take things kind of in a measure that isn't built on all of this anxiety. You know, everything about the Expanse and everything about um, whether it's Russia or China's or even the US's actions in the global economic marketplace today, so much of it is built off of this anxiety. And if you're constantly anxious all the time, how do you really measure what's dangerous versus what's not? Who's being peaceful versus who's actually being hostile? Um, you know, how do you really measure how much you need versus how much you think you need because you're anxious all the time over it? I think that China is saying that they're going to be in the um, Arctic Ocean, slugging it out for resources because that's where this seems to be going
Hmm.
ultimately.
Hmm.
Um, some sort of international conflict. You know, it's all part of to keep up this game of scarcity that they're only they're only binding themselves to because it's easy to say capitalism, but I don't think it's capitalism. I think it really is the people in power, the oligarchs or the executives or who's ever sitting on the CCP board. Um, I think it's I think it's a really small group of people who think that they have a right to assert this new techno feudalism,
Hmm.
which, by the way, is not present for all the criticisms that you can make about the Federation in the future. It does not seem like they're running a techno feudalism. It
Hmm.
doesn't seem like there's this clear hierarchy of a lord and then his
Hmm.
vassals and then the rest of us serfs being oppressed. That's clearly the hierarchy in The Expanse, and in multiple other science fiction shows. But in Star Trek, they seem to have finally evaded that bite, and it's because they've gotten away from this idea of scarcity and the philosophy surrounding it.
Right.
So that's been a long dovetail for the question of who colonized these two planets, but no, they're not on good terms. So when they beam Okana on board, who is played by the very good William O. Campbell.
Yes.
By the way, handsome man. Like they really picked.
The first time I remember seeing him, he was the Rocketeer.
Right. Growing up, The Rocketeer was one of my favorite movies.
Right.
That guy's a great actor who unfortunately never did more than what he did.
That's right.
But great actor, handsome man, natural wit.
Yeah.
But the first person he runs into is a very young Teri Hatcher. I did not expect to see her, but
yeah.
An interesting thing that they're trying to do, I think, this season, since the death of Yar, is introduce more secondary characters. And I think you see Teri Hatcher once or twice. There's a character named Sonia who's I think she's Geordie LaForge's assistant in engineering. She's in a couple episodes, but this is the part of the show where they're gonna start introducing people who are part of the transporter crew or who are a nurse in sick bay. They're going to start building out, I think, from this, and it's actually very interesting world building taking place, I think, in this episode where we see more of the Enterprise. We see how people are actually living, even though lower ranked officers.
It gives the whole story more depth.
Very much so.
Yeah.
I said earlier that this does feel kind of like a fluff episode, but there really is a lot of things going on here. Okana makes this joke as soon as he leaves the transporter that immediately starts the secondary story of Data trying to understand humor. One aspect of this show this episode that I wanted to reflect in the recording of this podcast was both kind of an examination of Data, looking at humor, kind of what you and I think about comedy, and what we think's funny, and then kind of what does it mean to be able to laugh as it relates to our humanness or our humanity. So, Data is told this joke, and he immediately realizes that he doesn't have a human understanding of humor. So he goes to Guinan, which I think is the beginning of this really great interplay between Brett Spiner and Whoopi Goldberg, because Brent's such a great actor, but Whoopi Goldberg's one of the finest comedians of our age. She really is. People don't understand how good she is, not only as Guinan, but in so many roles. She is one of the few to win I think the Academy Award. She's won an Emmy, a Tony, and a Golden Globe. So she's won them all. And of course, as we noted when she first debuted here in this season, a lifelong Star Trek fan. But her interplay with Data is really interesting because it leads Data to go to the holodeck. Once again, we're using the holodeck, where Data looks for a teacher to teach him humor. And you opened up a very interesting question in the notes that you send when we start setting up the episode. Is the holodeck supposed to do that?
Well, yeah, the comic Joe Piscopo, who was
Yes.
on Saturday Night Live, is the comic, and he immediately, takes on this teacher role. He knows that what Data's needs are, and he starts as teacher. It's like, wait a minute, if you program the holodeck to just have a comic in a cabaret type nightclub, did you necessarily program him to teach you how to be a comic or teach you what humor is? So it's one of those things where you just question, well, how does the holodeck really work? But that aspect I think makes the story interesting, the way they wrote it.
Well, it makes the last episode that we looked at, Elementary, Dear Data, much more profound because the computer has been able to create and generate a new life form now in the form of Moriarty, who is able
Right.
to gain sentience. Has the crew just kind of sat there and accepted, like, okay, we can break this thing sometimes and have it do things that we never expect, like teach Data humor? One thing that they do, and Joe Piscopo does it pretty well, is that he gets Data to take part in a Jerry Lewis routine.
Yes, right.
So, I have to ask you, growing up, who were the comedians that you found funny, and what was the kind of comedy that you were exposed to, both by your parents and just on your own?
The only time I can remember really humor, it would be in the mid to late 60s, was Roan and Martin's Laugh In.
Yeah,
Um, and then out of that was Flip Wilson, um, I think Don Rickles. Um, who else? Let's see.
Don Rickles is amazing.
I think there was shows like All in the Family had a lot of humor to it, and at the same time covered a lot of serious social issues. I think Sanford and Son,
Hmm.
Red Fox. I
Hmm.
really didn't
Oh yeah,
personally. I didn't expose myself to like a lot to George Carlin and Richard Pryor and that sort of thing. So it was more of comedy type shows, Hogan's Heroes, McHale's
right.
Navy. Uh,
I have to imagine, especially for your generation, there was a lot of World War II humor. Um, that was kind of grandfathered into your
some,
generation.
yeah,
Well,
yeah,
things like Hogan's Heroes,
yeah,
kind of taking the very serious aspect of a POW camp with you know
right,
Nazis and making them look like
right.
stooges.
And many
Um,
many of the actors in that series were Jewish.
right.
And
Um,
Robert Cleary, who played LeBeau, was in a concentration camp during World War II, and he wanted to play in it because it was an opportunity to really make fun of the Nazis.
See, in today's comedy, you wouldn't. Someone would hear that and they wouldn't get that. They would probably cancel him over that,
I think so. Yes.
just because I remember. So I'm not the biggest fan of her, but Roseanne Barr had a really good show when I was growing up. Roseanne, but she's also a brilliant stand-up comedian. She in 2006 went to this Jewish college magazine and she did this spoof of Hitler. And it's her dressed up in a kitchen as Hitler, and she has like a pan of cookies that are like shaped as little Jewish men and women, and it's
No.
terrible. It's the worst thing in the world. I shouldn't be laughing at it, but like, it's this Jewish magazine, and she got like such backlash for it. And I think one of the things that comedy, and this is the episode that I think really explores how humor works, is context. Um, I think context is something that is examined very explicitly here in The Outrageous Okana in terms of what's appropriate versus what isn't appropriate versus what we perceive to be funny versus what is effectively funny. And a lot of it comes down to like delivery. I bring up the Roseanne cover of her being Hitler because that had the worst delivery ever. Like, I'm laughing about it because it's so outrageously offensive that, I'm a little nervous even talking about it on this episode because someone might think that I actually like it, but I don't. It's just so ridiculous that, there's a line where humor is no longer funny. And I think that's something that we have to look at too in this episode, because there comes a situation with Okana that we have to face where we get into kind of the ancient what is the what is it
Oh,
called? The ancient morality play, or the
yeah,
archaic sense of
the sense of
righteousness,
righteousness.
or ancient codes involving
It's involving
procreation,
procreation, right?
which I think in this episode are looked at with a very humorous eye as well. Um,
Yes, I mean, when it starts to be apparent, that aspect of the story where Okana is, the head of one planet wants him because he stole the jewel of Benzan or something like that, and then the other one wants him because he thinks that Okana has impregnated his daughter. And when Picard starts to understand what's going on, you know, when they call it this ancient morality play and this archaic sense of righteousness, there's a little bit of a satirical approach. Like, we're past all this stuff. It's like,
yeah.
there's a new social mores where if, two people have sex and a baby results, it's like, okay, it happened. Somebody's got to be responsible for it. We figure all this out.
So I wanted to actually bring that up because we've actually seen this kind of play out before in the Star Trek universe, um, in Star Trek: The Wrath of Khan, when and it's funny that I mentioned the previous episode. Oh, it was Symbiosis, but Symbiosis stars the actor who played David, but Kirk's son.
Yeah.
There's a very interest. I've always thought that the reunion between Carol and Kirk, where she reveals David's parentage, um, has always been very interesting because on one hand, like Kirk, when she says, you had your career, I had my career, and I didn't think it was a big deal, and I just kept going on. On one hand, Kirk's like, okay, I can accept that. And then there's another part of him where he's like, but you didn't tell me I had a son. But at the same time, like, I think a lot of people today would be enraged by this. And I think this kind of gets back to that archaic morality play. In the future, it may not be verboten or morally or ethically bad to have sex with someone, produce an offspring, and then have nothing to do with that child in terms of their upbringing or having a relationship with them. And I think that's a very interesting view of the future.
Hmm.
I think it says something about the nature of family, where family is probably not relegated anywhere according to the bloodline, but maybe actual, choices of cohabitation, choices of marriage, you know, possibly people, get married and stay married and produce children, and that family stays together in terms of having a shared genetic lineage. But maybe certain, these ancient morality plays and these ancient customs, things like a genetic lineage no longer matter. So it doesn't matter who your parents are or if your parents were there or not.
Well, and plus the fact that this is in 1988, and that's when a lot of changes in family structure started to occur. That people would
Right.
have children, and they wouldn't necessarily be married, but they'd still be dedicated to one another. They'd be dedicated to the family, but they wouldn't be married, and so on. And you could say the other end, well, then that's also that there was an increase in teen pregnancies and single mothers and all of that sort of thing. There is that downside to it, but I think with this, the fact that these comments were made in this episode in December 1988 kind of reflected that there were changes starting then, and there's changes going on now. I mean, I think one of the biggest things that I would say is you see the acceptance of marriages or liaisons producing children of mixed race.
Right. Well, I think not only interracial marriages, I also think that you also see an acceptance of LGBTQ marriages
Yes.
and them
Yes.
adopting children.
Right.
Um, I think I can just say this here, living in New York here in 2021. Margot and I are married, but I think in our building, we are one of we are one of five couples. We are one of two couples that have children that are living together that are actually married. The rest of them are people in partnerships, and they're in long-standing partnerships where they've been living together for decades and they've produced kids, and they just live this way, and they're not married, and there's no there's no legal document binding them. They've just decided to
And
do
what
this.
you're saying is that as dedicated partners, they've still been responsible for loving and raising these children.
Absolutely. In many ways, and I don't know your view of it, and I would love to hear it. But speaking as someone, I got married in 2016 to Margot. I have never looked at anyone having an alternative formulation to their relationship, even in the form of polyamory or polygamous marriages. If people are agreeing to be in that, and no one's being harmed, no one's being abused, and everyone is somehow figuring out a way to make it work, I have never felt that anyone's alternative relationship or alternative lifestyle has ever had any sort of effect on the sanctity or quality or health of my own traditional heterosexual marriage. I don't understand. I think I grew up with conservatives in the South telling me that traditional marriage is under assault, traditional marriage is under assault, traditional marriage is under assault, but I just don't see it.
I mean, my feeling is that traditional marriage is fine. It should be encouraged, but it shouldn't be required based upon some of the different types of relationships that you mentioned. If people can be responsible adults and they can manage those relationships so no one is emotionally hurt, then there's no law against it. Plus the fact that I don't know what the current divorce rate is, but if people get married and then they get divorced, how if the divorce rate 10 years ago was supposed to be like 50% of all marriages ended up in divorce, then how serious is marriage? How important is it if it has that high of a failure rate, if that's the right term? So
I,
if you have an alternative type of relationship that works, how 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 can one be critical of it?
I've thought about this a lot. I think a lot of it is about. I think that at some point in Christianity, Judeo-Christianity owns some responsibility to this, and also some Eastern religions follow the same course. But I think the idea of marriage got so intertwined into the absolute nature of commitment and love and romance and kind of like this heroic romantic notion of a story. I think that we built a society that capped and surrounded all of that around the idea of that getting married was the period at the end of the sentence of this romantic epic we were supposed to live our lives to. That the day we had our wedding was the beginning of the real grand adventure between you and me, or husband and wife, and that was the scenario that produced the best outcome. I think the pressure of that and the pressure to live to that, and coupled with the outside pressure of having to live in a modern capitalist economy and deal with different educational structures and god knows different parenting styles, and sometimes having parents who aren't parents at all. Um, I think that traditional marriage and the onus to have a traditional marriage has fallen apart because you have to have some real privileges to make, that even a single family household, most people in 2021 both have to have dual incomes to make it work.
Right.
That puts real strain on a
Well,
relationship, in
sure.
any form of relationship, whether it's
Sure.
good or not.
Absolutely.
So I think it wasn't, you know, I think the conservatives were wrong. It wasn't like paganism or the gays or rock music or public schools or Satan or, Ozzy Osbourne that killed traditional marriage. It
Mm-hmm.
was just the way of the world that killed it,
Mm-hmm.
honestly. And
Mm-hmm.
the thing is, I think marriages still exist. Getting back to what I said about these partnerships that are pretty common throughout now, I think people can be married. I think they just don't want the state involved in it. And I
Mm-hmm.
think the state and the church got so involved in the idea that they had to take part in your union, or they had to declare something about your union, that everyone just said fuck this and abandoned it.
Well, the state evolved it from the civil side in terms of, property rights and, you know, uh, legal laws related to raising children and all, those responsibilities and so on. So,
Right.
that's going to be there to some extent always. But as you're saying, when it comes to child rearing, having a even be even be legally married isn't required to successfully do that now.
Well, there's three difficult things that are happening, and I know that we've kind of gotten away from the humor of Data for a second, but let's deal with Okana since we're talking about him. There's three interesting things that are happening with what's her name? Yanar and her father.
Yanar, yes.
Because on one hand, like, Yanar's father has to reclaim his honor because it seems like his daughter's been violated. That's a very ancient idea. The second one is that, like, okay, if she's been violated, she has to suddenly become the property of the man who violated her, which is very old and very biblical as well. The third one is that, like, Okana has to have this responsibility for this child. So dealing with the first two, I think the first two are honestly ridiculous because it's built on the idea that Yunar has no ownership or agency over herself or her body or her child. But the third one, I think, is something that we could talk about and dig into a bit because speaking as a father, I do think that to have a good functioning society, and I still think that this happens, and it happens in the episode where, Okana kind of forces Yunar and Deb, is his name Devin?
Um,
No, not Devin.
Benzan, Benzan,
Benzan,
right?
where Okana forces Yunar and Benzan's hand. But Okana does the right thing by saying, like, I'll marry her if, it means raising this child because this child's mine. I think there's still a sense in the future that you need to be responsible for children and that you can't just leave them out there on their own and abandon them. So, like, while the first two things, she has to be married because you violated her, or and I have to get retribution because you violated her. Those are those are Bronze Age bullshit ideas. The third one, though, I think is an internal idea that we can discuss. You know, shouldn't children be taken care of? Shouldn't we as adults automatically look to ourselves as being responsible for the well-being of children, no matter what their condition is in terms of how they come into the world? Like, isn't that a universal idea that should continue into the 24th century?
Yes, because if you go to all of the baptisms I've witnessed, including my children in the Presbyterian Church, there's an invitation to the congregation to share in the responsibility of upbringing that child. Now that's mainly focused on, religious teaching and moral teaching and so on. But there is the inference of a community responsibility there. And I think that the idea of public education is a realization that there is a public responsibility there. And there's been some articles, on the internet recently about how there's a real decrease in fertility rates, and that there was one today I read that fertility rates are falling in places like China, in India, Europe. United States is about we're not going to our population may not continue to grow. Then I read an article that says, well, we're at 8 billion now. We'll probably get to 10 billion by 2050, but then it's going to decline. We may end up by the 2100 to be back around, 7 billion, 6 billion,
Right.
something like that. So, and a reason I mention that is, there's this concern from economists and demographers that if we don't have enough offspring, who is going to provide, the tax money to support the elderly? How are you going to keep the economy going because you don't have consumers? Because capitalism is built on consumption. Um, are the Russians in 20 years going to have enough to even field a military? Things of that sort. So,
do you know what all that is?
Go ahead.
That's scarcity thinking.
It's scarcity thinking again. But the point I wanted to make is it demonstrates how important children are,
right,
and bringing them up in the proper environment. It's
exactly.
taking care of society.
Right.
And it's like there's all this controversy about, well, we should have a good, strong border control on the southern border, and all these people should not be trying to come to the United States and pouring across the border. But you have, that's a political issue. It's a racial issue, but at the same time, we need those workers.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the agricultural products are dependent upon these seasonal workers and so forth, HB1s or HB2s, whatever they are. And there's the other thing, just the aspect, the human and moral aspect. If these people are leaving countries where the conditions are so deplorable that I heard something on NPR today that as people are fleeing Libya and crossing the Mediterranean trying to get to Africa, that their 12, 13, 14-year-old children said, please rescue me, take me, otherwise I'd rather die to go back to Libya.
There have been.
How do you deal with that? How do you ignore that? And it gets back to the bigger picture of, somebody was saying that, we have to come together and figure out, if you want to stop mass immigration from El Salvador and Honduras and Guatemala and so forth, you have to figure a way to change things there so they don't want to leave.
Exactly.
Which gets into taking care of these children that are coming to the border at this point.
Well, a lot of these kids are being brought to the border and being abandoned.
Yes.
And it's becoming it's becoming a crisis of humanity where it's not just regular adults who are being left to die in the desert. It's kids who are 7 and 8. And, we're filming this for Ben. I mean, we're recording this for Ben. Sorry, folks, it's late. But I often think, if he had been born in El Salvador, had been born in Mexico, would he be stuck on this fate? Our destinies really are not. I don't believe our destinies are completely in our hands, and it really does sometimes come down to the environments that we're in. These children are living through hell. Isn't it our social responsibility as humans, to fix this? And I think that's really, as much as we can look at Yunar's father for some of his bullshit, the concern of, who's going to take care of this child is a really pertinent one, and I think it's one that everyone takes with relative seriousness. Um, they take on here in this episode. Um, one thing. So one thing that they actually one thing that they actually use in this episode, I don't think that we ever see used again, is the full conference mode, which
Oh
means
yes.
Star Trek. And but you know, I think it's interesting that in 1988, here in 2021, when we're talking about um, Zoom, in
And
1988,
Microsoft Teams, etc. Yeah.
in 1988,
Skype.
science fiction was playing with this idea that you could actually have two different people on a screen that you talk to at the same time. Uh, in terms of the technology that you were dealing with in 1988, what would you have thought about this?
Let's see. I mean, we didn't in 1988. We didn't even have cell phones, and the first cell phones we had were like these big bricks that you see in the movies. There, they weighed a pound and a half, and then we didn't even have fax machines then in 1988. So if you go back to that time, and that's what 30 years, we've come a long way because we've gone to uh, cell phones that are really smartphones, that are really mini computers. And, we've gone through fax, and now it's all gone to, you know, doing things, through the cyber world, through the internet, and uh, so on. But I made the comment about that because it goes back to that one show that William Shatner, was the host, about how Star Trek invented the future.
All
So
right.
here it goes again.
Well, I think in many cases, Star Trek, but science fiction in general, has a very good idea about um, the future of devices. One thing that I'm always very impressed with in terms of the science fiction genre is that a lot of these authors and a lot of these writers and artists are able to visualize kind of the modularization of technology and watching it get smaller and more integrative and it becoming more accessible to more people and it having a wider impact in terms of culture. Um, I really do think that Star Trek having a Zoom mode or having Zoom before any of us ever had Zoom uh, is. I definitely think there's probably a huge influence there. I mean, we have smartphones now because of the communicators from the original series.
Right.
But
Yes.
in many ways, I actually think I have to take that back. Flip phones for the communicators from the original series.
Hmm.
I actually think smartphones are probably the tricorders.
Hmm. Hmm.
Well, we can do so much with these things now. Like tricorders can take biometric readings.
Oh
I think
yeah.
these things can take
Oh yeah.
biometric data now.
Oh yeah. You're doing telemedicine off smartphone images now.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Um,
The other important point here is, at one point, when um, Picard has the different parties on conference mode, you get to the point, says we need to get people together face to face. So I
right.
think that's an important point now, is particularly because of the pandemic, everyone's gone to virtual meetings and so forth. And now, at least in the United States, the pandemic seems to be getting under control. The question is, well, how much are we going to keep business communications as virtual versus face to face? And I think there are times when face-to-face meetings will remain important. I don't know what the cutoff point or what the rules would be, as to say, well, we're really at the point we can't do this virtual. We really should do it face to face. I mean, one thing I thought of today's the news is that, not making a political comment at all, is that Biden and Putin are going to meet in Geneva on June
Oh
16th.
yeah.
They've had a number of telephone calls. I don't know whether they're like Madam Secretary, where Tayloni would always have a video call with the Premier of China, or the Chinese Foreign Minister, or some crazy person in the Caucasus area. But I think it's important that um, Biden and Putin meet. I think it's important, like Anthony Blinken, I think that's his first name, the new
Right.
Secretary of
Yes.
State, that he's sitting down in Jerusalem with Netanyahu, and then he's going over to Ramallah and he's talking to Abbas. You
Right.
know,
Well, I think that all comes down to, and all of these people are diplomats on in some level, and that comes down to Picard being a diplomat, because Picard at the center of this is stuck in this very difficult scenario where on one hand, like, he's dealing with a warp capable race. Like, Okana clearly has a warp drive, so he got this ship from one of these two planets, so they all have warp drives. So there's no worry of violating the Prime Directive here, and there's no real worry about violating anyone's culture, because there's no real cultural mores being violated here, except someone's daughter's pregnant and someone stole an item. Um, the fact that it's taking part in a ship means that he's legally entangled in it, since he offered Okana help. I think by trying to get everyone on board, I think he's trying to force Okana's hand faster, but also force the hand of Devin and Yunar's father, who I just can't remember his name.
and there's sort
But
of a convergence because O'Connor realizes he has to take the bull by the horns, that he's stuck in the middle, and since he knows that Picard's going to kind of push things to resolution, O'Connor figures out how he can push them two together so that the truth comes out.
so one thing that I love about the Okana character, and I think all good characters, and I think Okana and Picard actually have really good interplay in this episode
Hmm.
between each other. Like,
They do.
Picard knows. I think Picard thinks like, okay, this guy's a rogue asshole. Like, he thinks too much of himself, and I can't
Right.
stand him. But
Right.
he's a captain, and I think Picard suspects like this guy's trying to do the right thing.
Hmm.
But on the other hand, I think Okana looks at Picard and says like, I got this guy into trouble. I didn't mean to get you into trouble. I'm going to try my best to get out of it. I think Okana does the right thing when he's basically forced by these two rich kids into revealing their, scandal behind the scenes, where they've
Right.
basically been sneaking around, and, Benzin impregnated Yunar, and she
Hmm.
refuses to marry him unless he turned over this diamond. This is really typical rich person bullshit affecting us regular middle class, like, freighter
Right.
pilots in space.
Sure. Yes.
um,
Exactly.
I
Exactly.
think though that there's a humor to who's the father, or will she, won't she, that I think is played very well here by the Okana character, and he deals with all of this with a real sense of grace. In the midst, by the way, of sleeping with at least three women on
Yes. On the
the Enterprise.
Enterprise. Right.
Oh,
Yes.
um, if you had to pick in a fight, who would win, O'Connor or Worf? Because they keep looking at each other, and at one point they flat out say, like, "We'd do this if we
I
weren't
I
busy."
I'd go with Worf. Yes. I'd,
Really?
yeah, I'd go with Worf.
See, there's something. I think it'd be a fun fight, though.
It
Um,
it it, it would, yes, but I would go with Worf.
but I think I think Okan is an interesting character too, because he exemplifies, I think, a future where, in my generation, as progressive as we are, we're still kind of weird about things. Like, we're weird about women if they sleep with too many guys, we call them a slut. And that's started to change for men too, where if we find out that men are sleeping with too many women, we find that kind of gross. But in the future, like, Okana in this episode sleeps with at least two women and has designs on Troy clearly at one point. Um, I wonder if there is truly no worry of sexually transmitted diseases on the Enterprise. because there's I know in the future, and they covered this in Deep Space Nine, people can take, including men, can take a form of birth control that inhibits them from impregnating their partner. But I wonder if there's any real worry about the transmission of sexually transmitted diseases in the future, or if that's one of those things that you just go down to the holodeck and get get a hyperspray for.
I think that's just being ignored at this point. It doesn't
Yeah.
confound the story. There probably would be some issue.
Do you think that it's being ignored is a product of Roddenberry and his kind of open sexual nature, or do you think it's also the 80s and the fact that Reagan didn't talk about AIDS around this time either? Um, is there a conversation in society in 1988 about sexually transmitted diseases, or was that still one of those things that wasn't really
Oh,
talked
oh,
about? Because
oh
in the
yeah,
90s
sure.
we were talking about it a lot, especially
Oh, sure.
for
No,
kids
because
my age.
AIDS started showing up in 82, 83. So, yeah, that was a concern. I think what they do in Star Trek with this is that they just don't complicate things.
Right.
I think they ignore it because they just want to keep the stories cleaner and not throw that complication into it.
Well, I think also in space there's probably the good possibility that they've probably eliminated a lot of these sorts of diseases and
That's possible
viruses.
too.
You're
I would
you're probably yeah,
I would be very careful in dealing with green Orion women. That's all I have to say.
true. Um, well, there's probably not a space syphilis
Right.
that anyone's worried about. That'd be awful. Could you imagine Washington getting space syphilis? Um, well, Washington getting syphilis in general is pretty awful. So when Okana finally draws out the truth, Benzin finally formally offers to marry Yanar. Um, on one hand, there's the question of will this marriage result in a better relationship between the two planets? Though we'll never uh, see that, even though they start fighting about where they're going to live. Do you think that the nature of this marriage is monarchical?
Monarchical in terms of who the rulers will be.
Well, yeah, because it seems like these are two people in power, at least the parents are, and
It's
it seems
it's
like this marriage it's accepted by both fathers happily,
it's
but
hard to tell. It's hard to tell because there's no
I
indication whether these are elected officials or they're you know clan chieftains or whether they're royalty of any sort.
right, one thing that kind of makes this episode fluff for me is that there isn't a lot of world building in terms of the aggressors or the
Mhm. Right,
antagonists. And they're
right.
not really antagonists to begin with. There's really no bad guy
Yeah,
in this episode.
no, no.
Um okay, so let's let's get back to data and humor real quick. But before
Right.
we do that, sorry. So at one point, Wesley and Riker are talking about Okana, and Riker makes the point that at some point every man has to choose their own path, and Wesley makes a comment that he has made the choice about his life. Little does he know.
Right.
I think it's very interesting, and I wanted to touch on this for a second. I think it's very interesting how growing up all the way starting even in middle school, we would have something called homeroom,
Mm-hmm.
though later on in high school it was called pause after
Mm-hmm.
the our mascot was a cougar, ladies and gentlemen, so we had apex pause, which was an hour where we would fill out aptitude tests and look career packets. It seems very interesting that Wesley Crusher has kind of been privileged into this position where he gets to basically train to be an ensign before he enters the academy. So at a young age, he's kind of planned out his life already. We know, later on in the show that he actually decides to leave Starfleet and become a traveler,
Mm-hmm.
which is kind of this extra dimensional being that can manipulate space time. But it seems interesting to me the pressure we kind of put on young people today to know what they're going to be doing when they're 30, when they're 40, when they're 50. And I was just wondering, what was it like for you growing up in terms of the pressure that was applied on you to figure out your future? Because I can tell you for me growing up, and this would be in the early 2000s, there was a lot of pressure to know what you were going to do by the time you were 18 and kind of go to college and figure it out there. Did you feel the pressure to know what your career was when you were 18?
I personally didn't feel any pressure. Um, I think that, and I didn't even. I think there was an expectation. Um, a lot of it had to do with so many men coming back from World War II took advantage of the GI Bill, so you had this big increase in the number of college graduates. So there was an expectation for both men and young women that if you could go to college, you should. There wasn't a great deal of pressure as to what your career path would be. However, it was smart. I mean, once you got into college, even in the 70s, 60s, and 70s, at some point you had to declare a major so that you could
Hmm.
get a degree in something. And, I really didn't. I mean, I graduated from college in 74, not going into all the stories and stuff, but I didn't understand where I was going to end up career wise until 1978. So
Wow.
after I got out of college, it really took me 4 years to sort it out.
Yeah, I would say that was probably the same for me ultimately. I think a lot of it is the pressure of the job market today,
Hmm.
where you really do have to, if you really do get a degree, there really is kind of a set number of fields that you're able to actually enter to, um, that directly apply to your education. A lot of them, especially when it comes to a liberal studies degree,
Hmm.
a lot of it is what you can make for yourself in terms of the skills and experiences that you acquire. But that is something that seems to be, I don't know. I think in the future where there's not a scarcity society and you have the Federation, Wesley Wesley could go into Starfleet as an officer, serve for 10 years, maybe get up to lieutenant commander, become the chief engineer of of a Starfleet vessel, but then retire with the possibility of doing something else in the future. It seems very interesting that he already has this idea of his life set up when there's a real possibility of life afterward, especially with an elongated lifespan, you know, the ability to pursue other opportunities. Do you think that it's healthy for him at this age to already have this idea or notion? Or do you think it's just normal?
I think he's so young, he's actually being a little naive about himself because, again, as you said, I don't know what his chronological age is supposed to be, but
He's supposed to be
he
15 here.
well then he's young enough to be naive and not understand
Hmm.
that he needs to give himself a little bit more time.
Right. Well, I also think it's interesting how he is um, being groomed for it as much by the crew
Right.
as it is him being naive. Like, there's also, I think, a certain naivety on the crew's end as well, in
They're
terms of,
they're yeah, they're kind of guiding him onto a path. Right.
well, I think it gets, and I wanted you to speak to this because I think about this a lot when it comes to Ben. I think the guidance of children in terms of helping them figure out who they're going to be is so much more complicated than we actually admit to it being. In terms of just, and I don't want you to get into great detail if you don't want to, um, but just watching your children progress to the people that they become, how much do you think accounted to like decisions you made versus decisions that were completely out of your hands?
I think just that,
Or
you
better
know,
yet, here, let me rephrase the question.
okay, go ahead.
If you had like a, let's say you have a 50-50 ratio and you had to scale it to properly reflect what you think the actual measurement was, how do you measure what you think your actual impact was versus the choices that your children made in terms of their outcomes?
I really think it's like 20-25% parental influence and 70 to 85% what the child as they grew older want. And what the job of parents is, well, I think what mom and I tried to do is just to give you all, expose you to as much as we possibly could in terms of
Right.
experiences and knowledge and so on.
Right. I agree with that ratio. I think in some cases going forward, I think I had to deal with things that you and mom could never prepare me for. And in some ways, generationally, I got really lucky. Like, I didn't get exposed to social media until college, but I can only imagine the kind of like shithole minefield my life would have been if I had been at Claymont Elementary and there had been something like Facebook or Twitter. Oh,
Oh yeah, yeah.
like just disasters. I think a lot of what kids are going to have to face, just because of technology, I think technology puts so much more of the onus on them to have to figure out themselves that, 25, I think for you, in terms of the impact you made, is reasonable, but I think going in the future, I'm not, there may be a future where I can say, like, I really only had 20% impact, maybe 15% impact. But that's because Ben is going to have to face a whole new set of challenges that I didn't, and I really do think that they're going to come down to technology. Um,
Could, yes.
and
Yeah.
when that takes place, I really do think, and this is a philosophical topic for another episode because we'll definitely get into these sort of episodes. But our private individual interaction with technology is going to have such a huge impact on our individual futures that I don't think that we've really have a way to measure that yet in terms of
No, no,
where it's going to go.
you're right. I think that's true.
I actually think we have the technology. We have the technology to start doing it, but measuring it,
Well,
no.
and that gets into just so much how education is changing because of technology's involvement in education, even.
Right. Exactly. Well, I think a lot of education in the future is really going to be self-determined and self-motivated, where it may not be as institutionalized, but you know, I have a feeling that Starfleet Academy itself may not be as institutionally organized as it looks. Um, the military itself, well, we'll get into a conversation about that next episode, whether Starfleet is an actual military organization or not. Um, so before we go, we have to get back to really the main topic of the show, and that's Data's humor. So I asked you earlier some of the comedians you grew up with. I grew up with Dave Chappelle and Louis Black, and I actually got exposed very, very early on to George Carlin through his books. Actually, I grew up as a huge fan of Napalm and Silly Putty, which was a collection of his materials as well as some of his own written work. Um, Kathleen Madigan, Wanda Sykes has been a huge comedic influence. I love Joe Rogan. I really grew up liking Jimmy Kimmel. Jon Stewart, I think in terms of my two big comedic influences, I have to say it's Jon Stewart from The Daily Show and Dave Chappelle from The Chappelle Show, which are two Comedy Central shows. But like those really generationally for me were my two. What? So saying all that, I think that we have very different ways of looking at humor and what attracts us. I think the interesting thing about Data and him determining his own sense of humor is that on one hand, he has this panoply of experiences and definitions and ideas that he can expose himself to, but he has the he doesn't have the ability, I think, to there's a lot of questions during the show about the timing of jokes and how you deliver a joke, and Guinan makes a joke at one point that Data kills one. Um, what do you think is the barrier between Data understanding humor and being able to tell a joke and not?
I think it is one of the last things in the episode where, and I don't remember what the line is, but he tells a joke about Worf, and it is very subtle. And it's almost as if he didn't try to be hu- hu- humorous. So I think with Data, since when he tries to be uh, uh, humorous in a very specific way, it's so unnatural for him. But when he doesn't try, then he can really do something funny.
It's almost like the big cosmic joke is that when Data forgets that he's human,
Yes,
he becomes human again, but the moment he thinks about it, he's
right.
no longer. And it makes me
That's
wonder about our own existence. Like, I'm a big fan of Taoism, and Taoism thinks that the way that you find your best self or your best humanity, or you bring yourself back to the Tao, is learning not to think about it and live in the
uh-huh.
moment
Yes.
versus kind of forcing this kind of constructed self into the world. Um, do you think, and this is a very big philosophical question that we'll end the episode with, and we don't have to answer it completely. We don't have to answer any of these questions completely, folks, and it's getting late. Um, do you think Data, when he focuses on being human, actually loses touch with his natural humanity?
I tend to say yes.
See, I think so too, and I think that has a lot of implications to it in terms of how we define our own selves. Because if you look at Data from an android perspective or a cybernetic perspective, he's a machine created to do tasks or perform certain functions or get certain objectives completed. I think in many ways, and you brought up, I know that you're reading something very different now, but you recently finished the Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. I think, you know, um, I've also done a lot of reading about the Holocaust. I think when we note people in history losing their humanity, it's when they're making a conscious choice to complete an objective that they know is so far from what is humanly ethical and moral that they just know and they stop being humans because they know what they're doing is so inhumane versus if they weren't doing those things and they weren't thinking about these violent intentions or these violent objectives or figuring out these tasks and completing these tasks, they are more their natural selves. What do you think? Do you think that this is being reflected in Data? That when Data doesn't think about being human, he actually becomes human? It gets into the question of, um, Moriarty asks, if I think, therefore I am. But if we think of what we are, do we lose a sense of that thing that we are? Because in some cases, the arguments being made here with Data is that when he thinks about trying to be funny, he can't be funny. But when he
That's
stops thinking about it, he becomes funny.
that is exactly what I saw at the very end with the Worf joke. Yes.
But what do you think that means in terms of him determining his humanity versus how we determine our own humanity?
I think the point I'm getting from what you just said is if you stop and focus on yourself when you're interacting with the world, you are kind of projecting yourself inward. But when you project yourself into the world and don't think about yourself, but you're part of it, you really become part of the world and you're actually more effective in it.
Yes, exactly. It seems to me that like Data has the opposite effect in some ways because the interesting about thing about our our authentic humanity, I don't want to use that term because Data has authentic humanity. He's just not an authentic being. Um, I think the authentic thing about our humanity is that we can learn to be more humorous, we can learn to be more warm and welcoming, we can learn to be more forgiving and all of these things. In some ways, I think it might be the opposite of Data, where Data doesn't have to learn these things, he already inhabits these things. So when he starts thinking about how to do these things, he loses the ability to do them naturally.
Well, yeah,
He can't put them together.
it's sort of like he suffers from Dr. Pulaski doesn't expect data to have the ability to do the things that he does,
Right.
and part of that is Data doesn't have his own expectation that he can do these very human things, but he does. So
Right.
his challenge is to accept the humanity that he really does have.
And maybe accept the humor around him, be it and not being so conscious of it, of just but living in the
Yes.
moment of it.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
In some ways, the funniest people sometimes don't realize that they're funny.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
on that, I think that we will end for tonight.
Okay.
Before we go, I just want to make sure that I get the next episode right because it's a good one. Everyone, we'll see you next time for Star Trek Season 2, Episode 5, Loud as a Whisper. Thank you for joining us for The Outrageous Okana, and thank you for joining me again, Dad.
Thank you, Jay. Good night.
Good night.